The sun rose over Utah's quiet suburban streets, glinting off white fences and the clean glass windows of homes that looked almost identical from one to the next. To most, it was just another peaceful morning in the small community of Springville, but to millions watching online, it was the picture-perfect world of the Franke family. Ruby Franke's voice, sweet and steady, filled computer screens across the world as she began another vlog for her channel 8 Passengers. "Good morning, passengers," she'd chirp, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and the camera in the other. Behind her, her children would shuffle into the frame, sleepy-eyed and smiling, as viewers commented how wholesome, how perfect, how inspiring they were. It began as a simple family vlog, one mother sharing her day-to-day life with 6 children, her husband Kevin, and the values they lived by as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For Ruby, the channel was more than just a hobby. It was her mission, a testimony of faith and motherhood. Every upload captured lessons, chores, discipline, and family prayers. The world saw a household of order and love, a modern Mormon family grounded in moral structure. Yet beneath that frame-perfect lighting, cracks were starting to form. Shari Franke, the oldest daughter, noticed them first. She had grown up with the camera's red light blinking through nearly every major moment of her life. Birthdays, graduations, family vacations, nothing was private. At first, it felt normal. Her mother said they were showing people how to be better families. But as Shari grew older, she started to see what others couldn't or didn't want to. The punishments were getting harsher, the tone colder, and the image of perfection more forced with every passing year. Ruby's parenting rules became infamous among viewers. She'd proudly share stories of taking away her son's bed as punishment or refusing to bring lunch to school for a child who forgot it, insisting it would teach them responsibility. The internet divided over her methods. Some called her brave, a strict but loving mother raising independent kids. Others called it cruel. But Ruby didn't flinch. She dismissed criticism as weakness. The world was too soft, she said. She was raising warriors of faith. By 2020, 8 Passengers had more than 2 million subscribers, sponsorship deals, and a devoted fan base. Ruby had found her identity online, while Kevin, her husband, worked as an engineering professor at Brigham Young University. He appeared occasionally on camera, always soft-spoken, seemingly proud of his wife's growing success. But behind the scenes, the family dynamic was changing. Ruby had started spending more time with a woman named Jodi Hildebrandt, a counselor and the founder of Connections, a life coaching organization based on strict moral accountability. Jodi was a figure of authority and conviction, known in local circles for her uncompromising ideas about sin and personal responsibility. To Ruby, Jodi became a mentor, even a spiritual partner. They talked constantly, and over time, Jodi's ideology began to shape Ruby's every decision. Family friends noticed Ruby's tone changing, less warmth, more rigidity. She began to speak in absolutes, using Jodi's words as doctrine. "Pain is a gift," Ruby would tell her children. "Suffering means you're learning." Kevin worried, but Ruby brushed him off. "You just don't understand truth," she said once, her voice distant. Shari, by then a college student, saw the shift and felt powerless to stop it. When she came home to visit, she found her younger siblings quieter, more withdrawn. The walls felt different, the laughter gone. There were no longer family game nights or movie marathons. Instead, Ruby and Jodi were hosting sessions, hours-long discussions about sin, repentance, and obedience. Children were made to confess faults in front of others. Tears were met with lectures about humility. On the channel, Ruby kept smiling. Viewers saw organized schedules, smiling faces, and catchy titles like Teaching Accountability and When Your Kids Need to Learn Consequences. The vlogs masked reality so effectively that even when discomfort showed through, it was brushed off as tough love. Some fans began reporting her videos, but YouTube rarely intervened. She wasn't breaking a clear rule. She was just parenting differently. By 2021, Shari had begun distancing herself publicly. She stopped appearing on the channel, stopped responding to her mother's calls. Online, she posted subtle messages about healing and boundaries. People noticed. Rumors began circulating that she'd been cut off from the family. Ruby didn't deny it. In one vlog, she said sometimes children choose darkness, and that parents must let them suffer the consequences. Viewers speculated she was talking about Shari, but Ruby never said her name. At home, Kevin's marriage was collapsing. He had grown increasingly concerned about Jodi's influence, saying she was driving a wedge between him and his family. Arguments turned into silence. Eventually, he moved out. The separation was quiet, with Ruby telling her followers that Kevin was on a spiritual journey and that their marriage was still rooted in faith. In truth, he'd reached his limit. "I couldn't recognize my wife anymore," he would later tell documentary filmmakers. When Kevin left, Ruby and Jodi became inseparable. Together, they launched Connections Classroom, a podcast and counseling venture that promised to help people live in truth. Their content grew darker, warnings about evil energy, spiritual blindness, and how misbehavior in children was evidence of rebellion against divine order. Ruby's tone shifted from nurturing to authoritarian. To her followers, she was no longer just a mom, she was a prophet of discipline. Her younger children bore the brunt of it. Ruby and Jodi began isolating them, pulling them from public life, restricting communication, and framing it as spiritual cleansing. Friends and relatives were cut off. Neighbors noticed Ruby's house was quieter than ever, curtains always drawn. People wondered but rarely intervened. In Utah, privacy and family boundaries were sacred. In early 2023, small signs of alarm surfaced online. A few concerned viewers pointed out that Ruby hadn't posted in months. The once active family had vanished from YouTube. Jodi's Connections channel was still active, with Ruby appearing in stark, emotionless videos, preaching about humility through suffering. Her words grew chilling. "When you're in pain, it means God is refining you." Shari, who had stayed silent for years, was growing increasingly anxious. Through whispers from friends, she heard that her siblings weren't attending school and hadn't been seen in public. She tried to contact them, but Ruby never responded. Messages went unanswered. Calls were blocked. She considered going to the police, but had no proof. The world had mostly moved on from 8 passengers. YouTube fame is fickle. Yesterday's favorite family was today's forgotten channel. But on August 30, 2023, everything changed. In a small town in southern Utah, a malnourished child knocked on a neighbor's door, begging for food and water. His wrists and ankles were bound in duct tape. The neighbor, horrified, called 911. The boy told police he had escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's home. Inside, officers found another child, also injured, malnourished, terrified. When Ruby Franke stepped out of that same house in handcuffs, the world gasped. The once celebrated mother of 8 passengers, the woman who preached about faith and discipline, was now charged with aggravated child abuse. The details stunned even her harshest critics. According to police reports, the children had been subjected to starvation, emotional isolation, and physical restraint. They had been denied basic needs in the name of repentance. The evidence showed patterns of long-term abuse, allegedly justified by the teachings of Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby's twisted interpretation of religious discipline. News spread like wildfire. Former fans flooded social media in disbelief, revisiting old videos with new eyes. "How did we not see it?" one viewer tweeted. Clips that once seemed harmless now felt sinister, a stern look, a forced smile, a child's nervous laughter. The internet became a detective's den, dissecting every frame of Ruby's past content. Meanwhile, Shari finally spoke publicly. Her voice trembled as she posted an Instagram story that simply read, "Finally." It wasn't celebration, it was relief. Relief that her siblings were safe, that the nightmare she'd feared had finally come to light. In the following days, she cooperated with authorities, helping investigators understand the family's complex history. She told them about Jodi's influence, her mother's descent into obsession, and her own efforts to protect the younger children. Ruby and Jodi were both arrested that same day and charged with multiple counts of aggravated child abuse. Each faced potential sentences ranging from 4 to 60 years in prison. As the mugshots spread online, people struggled to reconcile the smiling YouTube mother with the woman behind bars. For Kevin Franke, the news was devastating yet unsurprising. In the Hulu docuseries released later, he admitted he had been aware that Ruby's behavior had become severe, but never imagined the extent. "I thought she was just lost in belief," he said. "I didn't know it had turned into this." When the story broke, major networks descended on Utah. True crime fans, journalists, and psychologists all weighed in. How does a mother who seemed so devoted cross into cruelty? Theories ranged from religious extremism to emotional manipulation. But for Shari, none of it was abstract. It was her life. The internet was talking about her family, the family she had once fought to save. That night she couldn't sleep. Cameras were everywhere. Reporters camped outside. But her thoughts weren't on fame or scandal. They were with her siblings, recovering somewhere under state protection. She wondered if they would ever heal, if they would remember the warmth that used to fill their home before the cameras and commandments replaced love. The next morning, when she saw her mother's face on every news channel, Shari didn't feel anger. She felt grief. The woman in the mugshot wasn't the mother who used to braid her hair or bake cookies on Sundays. That version of Ruby had been gone for years. What remained was a stranger, one who had traded love for control and faith for fear. For the public, it was the latest shocking entry in the true crime era of influencer culture. But for Shari Franke, it was the end of childhood, and the beginning of the long, painful process of telling the truth. When the sun came up over Springville that next morning, news trucks lined the streets like a slow-moving parade. Reporters stood in front of the Franke house, microphones ready, narrating the downfall of a one-sidalized family. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, whispering to one another, remembering the smiling woman who used to wave from her driveway while filming her children. Now, police tape fluttered across the gate where those same children had once filmed birthday vlogs and Christmas morning surprises. Inside a quiet hotel room nearby, Shari sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through headlines that didn't feel real. YouTube mom arrested for child abuse. 8 passengers star in custody battle from hell. Her mother's face was everywhere, frozen mid-expression in the booking photo. Cold. Blank. She tried to remember when it had all shifted from discipline to danger. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but 100 small ones. Maybe it was the way her mother's eyes hardened whenever someone questioned her authority. Or how she stopped saying, "I love you," and replaced it with, "You need to repent." The investigators had been kind, but their questions cut deep. They asked about Jodi, about what went on in those private lessons she and her mother used to hold. Shari had been there in the beginning. She remembered Jodi's living room spotless, silent, with framed scriptures on every wall. Jodi's voice was calm but sharp, every word weighed like a judgment. "Truth," she'd said once, "isn't kind, it's correction." Ruby soaked up those lessons like medicine. Shari hadn't realized at the time that it was poison. In the months before the arrests, Jodi's influence had grown absolute. Ruby called her a vessel of God. She began to see sin everywhere, in laughter and defiance, even in hunger. When one of the younger kids asked for dessert after dinner, Ruby snapped that wanting more was selfishness. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was purification. Shari's little brother Chad once told her over text that mom had new rules. When Shari asked what that meant, he didn't answer. Later, she learned he'd been sent away for lying, made to live with a distant family member for months. Ruby called it reform. Shari called it exile. At the police station, investigators laid out photos, evidence from the house where her siblings had been found. Shari couldn't bear to look, but the images haunted her. The duct tape, the ropes, the tiny bowls used for food. It wasn't the home she remembered. It was a cell. One of the officers told her that her younger brother had been so starved he could barely stand. He had injuries on his arms that looked like they'd come from restraint. Shari felt her stomach twist. This wasn't neglect. This was torture. The world devoured every new detail. Comment sections filled with outrage and disbelief. Former fans of Eight Passengers rewatched old videos, timestamping moments they now considered warning signs. When Ruby laughed at a crying child when she denied them a meal. When she said, "You'll thank me one day," everything was reinterpreted. True crime channels analyzed every frame, every word, every expression. The story became a phenomenon, another tragic chapter in the dark side of family vlogging. Meanwhile, Kevin Franke tried to hold what remained of his family together. He hadn't lived with Ruby for over a year, but guilt followed him like a shadow. In his first statement, he said he was shocked and heartbroken, that he had no idea of the severity. People doubted him. Online, commenters accused him of turning a blind eye, but Kevin wasn't silent anymore. In the Hulu docuseries, his voice trembles as he describes his last months with Ruby. "She stopped seeing the kids as people," he says, eyes wet. "They became symbols of proof of obedience, proof that she was right." Ruby and Jodi sat in jail awaiting trial. Their mugshots became iconic in their own grim way, plastered across true crime blogs and morning shows. They refused to comment publicly, but Jodi's followers insisted they were being persecuted for their faith. In their view, society couldn't understand true correction. It was the same justification Ruby had used for years, and it was unraveling in real time. Shari didn't want fame, but it found her. Reporters reached out, podcast producers offered interviews, book agents sent contracts. She declined them all at first. The attention felt invasive, like another camera in her face. She had grown up performing for strangers. Now they wanted her pain as entertainment. But one night she sat in front of her mirror and stared at her reflection, the reflection of a daughter who had spent years being told her truth was rebellion. That was when she decided to speak. Not for money, not for publicity, but for her siblings. The Hulu documentary began filming quietly months after the arrest. Producers wanted to show the full scope, not just the crime, but the rise that made it possible. They approached Shari first. She hesitated, but Kevin encouraged her. "It's your story too," he said, so she agreed. When the cameras started rolling, the old instincts kicked in: posture straight, voice calm, every answer measured. But this wasn't Eight Passengers. This wasn't her mother's version of life. It was raw, unfiltered. Shari spoke about the early days, about how her mother had once been nurturing, how their home had been filled with music and laughter before perfection became an obsession. She talked about the fear that grew when Ruby began enforcing Jodi's teachings, how love turned conditional, how faith became weaponized. The crew listened in silence. When she described the day she was cut off, her voice broke. "She told me I was an agent of darkness," Shari said softly, "all because I asked her to let the kids see their friends again." There was no anger in her tone, only sorrow. She still loved her mother, even after everything. That perhaps was the hardest truth of all. As production continued, Shari met with her father often. They both wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen for so long. The documentary team traced the timeline, from Ruby's YouTube fame to her partnership with Jodi, the growing isolation, the collapse of her marriage, the eventual crimes. They found patterns that repeated across many family vloggers: the pressure to stay perfect, the performative discipline, the loss of privacy. But Ruby's story was unique in how completely she surrendered to control. In early 2024, as the trial approached, Ruby appeared briefly in court. The once polished influencer looked hollow, her hair gray at the roots, her eyes distant. When the charges were read, she didn't react. The prosecution detailed the conditions of her children, the starvation, the injuries, the emotional torment. Jodi's lawyers tried to frame it as misguided therapy, an extreme interpretation of spiritual correction. The judge didn't buy it. Both women pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. When the sentence was announced, terms that could total decades in prison, the courtroom was silent. Shari sat in the back row, clutching her father's hand. For her, there was no victory in it, only a deep, aching grief. When Ruby was led away, she turned briefly as if to look for someone. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Shari didn't see hate or denial, just emptiness. Afterward, Shari stepped outside into a crowd of cameras and flashing lights. Journalists shouted questions. Do you forgive her? How are your siblings? Will you write a book? She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered something to herself. This isn't where it ends. In the following months, she worked with therapists, advocates, and legal teams to ensure her younger siblings were placed safely. Slowly, she began rebuilding connections with them. Their conversations were cautious at first, their memories fractured. Trauma had made trust difficult. Sometimes they cried together, sometimes they just sat in silence. They were trying to remember how to be a family again, a real one, not a filmed one. Meanwhile, the documentary took shape. The producers wove together the past and present home videos from 8 passengers, police reports, courtroom footage, and new interviews with family and friends. The contrast was haunting. Clips of Ruby smiling beside her children played alongside her mugshot, her cheerful voice overlapping with news anchors reading her charges. Viewers would later call it one of the most chilling true crime series of the decade. When Shari watched the finished cut for the first time, she felt sick. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it was true. Seeing her childhood condensed into footage of staged perfection and hidden pain was like watching a ghost story, except the ghosts were still alive. Her mother's voice, once comforting, now echoed like a haunting refrain. You'll thank me one day. The series aired in early 2025 under the title Devil in the Family, The Fall of Ruby Franke. Within days, it dominated social media. Audiences were captivated by the juxtaposition of faith, fame, and abuse. Viewers flooded comment sections with anger, empathy, and disbelief. Some said it was a wake-up call for online parenting culture. Others treated it like entertainment, binge-watching the tragedy of a real family. Shari avoided reading most of it. She knew that people meant well, but they didn't know the cost. They didn't know what it was like to live every day trying to unlearn fear, to love without expecting punishment. Yet, amidst the noise, something meaningful happened. Strangers began reaching out, people who had escaped controlling families, manipulative mentors, or religious extremism. They thanked her for speaking out. For many, her story gave them permission to tell their own. That spring, Shari decided to write her memoir. She called it The House of My Mother because that house, she said, was both her cage and her foundation. The writing process was brutal. She had to relive moments she'd buried for years, but it was healing too. Kevin supported her through it, proud but careful not to intrude. He knew this was her story to tell. By the time the documentary's final episode aired, the Franke family had become a symbol, a warning about the dangers of mixing perfection with control, belief with domination. For Shari, though, it was simply a reminder of survival. Every day she carried pieces of her past, the pain, the lessons, the love she still wished she'd had. In one of her interviews near the end of the series, she said something that lingered with viewers long after the credits rolled. Forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about letting myself go free. That line would become the quote most associated with her story. But what few people knew was that the healing was far from over. The younger siblings were still in therapy, still learning to live without fear. Kevin was slowly rebuilding his life, balancing guilt with gratitude. And somewhere behind prison walls, Ruby Franke still wrote letters that Shari hadn't yet decided whether she would ever open. The months following the release of Devil in the Family were a blur of interviews, podcasts, and public reaction. The story had exploded far beyond what Shari ever expected. Her face appeared on magazine covers, morning shows analyzed every quote, and the world wanted more details about the daughter who dared to speak against the perfect mother. The docuseries had done what no police report could. It forced people to look at the emotional cost of image, belief, and control. For Shari, fame felt like a second imprisonment. Every message, every trending hashtag was a reminder of what she'd lost. She couldn't go online without seeing clips of her childhood replayed by strangers. People debated her trauma like it was a plotline. But beneath the noise, there was also something sacred happening. People were waking up. Parents, Survivors and former fans wrote letters telling her that her courage helped them leave toxic homes or question abusive spiritual leaders. In their pain, she found purpose. Still, some nights the quiet was unbearable. She'd wake up from dreams where she heard her mother's voice, the familiar cadence of discipline disguised as love. She'd see the kitchen table where they used to pray, the camera blinking in the corner, and she'd feel the weight of the lens that never stopped watching. Her therapist told her these were echoes, the mind trying to process years of confusion. But Shari knew that part of her still missed Ruby. Not the woman she became, but the one she used to be. The mother who brushed her hair and told bedtime stories, before Jodi, before the rules, before everything collapsed. Kevin was healing in his own quiet way. He had returned to teaching part-time, keeping to himself, avoiding interviews except when necessary. When he did speak publicly, his tone was heavy but composed. "I wish I'd seen sooner," he said once in a televised interview. "I thought discipline was just a phase. I didn't realize it had become faith without mercy." People criticized him, but Shari defended her father. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that was more than she could say for most. As 2025 unfolded, Ruby and Jodi remained behind bars. Occasionally, letters arrived at the legal office representing the children. Ruby wrote in neat handwriting, addressing them as "my precious souls." In her letters, she didn't apologize. Instead, she wrote about God's refinement, about how truth burns away the lies of the world. The state kept the letters on file, undecided on whether to pass them on. Shari read one once, just one. It was like reading a sermon written by a ghost. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no sorrow, only conviction. She folded it back into the envelope and told the lawyer not to send her any more. The younger siblings were making progress slowly. They lived with guardians chosen by the court, attending therapy, learning to trust teachers and friends again. Shari visited often, though it wasn't always easy. They were cautious, sometimes angry, sometimes silent. Trauma had made emotions unpredictable, but there were moments of light too, laughter during movie nights, board games that ended in real smiles. Shari cherished those glimpses. Each one was proof that recovery, though fragile, was possible. One afternoon, months after the series aired, Shari received a call from the Hulu producers. The docuseries had been nominated for multiple awards, including Outstanding True Crime Documentary. They invited her to attend the ceremony in Los Angeles. At first, she hesitated. It felt strange to celebrate something born from pain, but Kevin encouraged her. "It's not about fame," he said. "It's about truth reaching people." So she agreed. At the awards event, the lights were blinding, the applause overwhelming. Cameras flashed as Shari walked the red carpet, dressed in a simple black gown. Reporters shouted questions about forgiveness, faith, and her future. She smiled politely but said little. When Devil in the Family won, the director took the stage and dedicated the award to the children, whose voices were silenced for too long. The crowd stood in applause. Shari stayed seated for a moment, tears forming before she finally rose. She didn't see it as a victory, it was a memorial. After the ceremony, she stepped outside onto a quiet balcony overlooking the city. The night air smelled of rain and exhaust. For the first time in years, she felt a strange kind of peace. The world finally knew the truth, but she no longer needed it to understand her. She had learned that closure doesn't come from headlines or awards, it comes from surviving your own story. In the months that followed, Shari focused on her memoir, writing late into the night. The process became a kind of exorcism, each chapter an act of reclaiming her voice. She wrote about growing up in the shadow of a camera, about love twisted into obedience, about the cost of silence. She didn't spare herself either. She wrote honestly about the guilt she felt for not speaking out sooner, about the moments she still doubted her own memories. The book wasn't written to punish her mother. It was written to set herself free. When The House of My Mother was published, it climbed bestseller lists almost immediately. Critics called it haunting, brave, and deeply human. But for Shari, success meant something quieter. It meant her story was no longer trapped inside her. She had turned pain into something that could help others heal. Letters poured in from readers who saw themselves in her words. children raised in religious extremism, survivors of emotional abuse, and even former vloggers who confessed they had lost themselves chasing an image of perfection. Yet despite all the progress, there were still moments when the past crept back in unexpected ways. Sometimes, she'd catch herself hesitating before speaking, waiting for correction that would never come. Other times, she'd visit a store and see a smiling family recording a vlog, and her chest would tighten. She didn't hate them. She just wished they knew what they were giving up in exchange for attention. Hulu's producers reached out again, this time about a follow-up documentary, one that would focus not on the crime but on healing. They wanted to show what came after the headlines. Shari agreed, but under one condition: no recreations, no dramatizations, no sensationalism. She wanted honesty, even if it was quiet. The follow-up special aired in late 2025 under the subtitle Rebuilding the Frankes. It showed Shari visiting her siblings, volunteering at youth centers, and speaking with other survivors. It wasn't flashy. It was raw, full of awkward silences, half-smiles, and the unglamorous truth of recovery. In one of the closing scenes, Shari visited her childhood home. The house was empty now, the walls stripped of decorations, the rooms hollow. She walked through the kitchen where her mother once filmed cooking tutorials, her fingers tracing the faded marks where tripods used to stand. She stopped in the living room, looking out the same window where she had once stood as a child while her mother spoke to millions online. The air was still. Dust floated in beams of afternoon light. "This is where it all started," she said quietly to the camera. "A house that felt like love but taught us fear." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "But now it's just a house, and that's okay, because we don't live here anymore." The screen faded to black. Viewers described that moment as haunting but freeing. It became one of the most replayed clips from the special, a symbol of leaving the past behind. After filming, Shari stayed in Utah for a few more weeks, visiting family, friends, and old neighbors.